So this is now the engine bay of my 1984 Jeep Scrambler. As you can tell, there's no more 4.2 liter straight six in here. There's no grease, no oil. Normally that's what you'd see. That's actually what keeps most Jeeps from rusting, is the amount of leaking from the engine, transmission, and so forth. I still have plenty underneath from the transmission. As you'll see that I've connected directly to it. So I just want to talk to you this briefly, give folks an understanding of what I've got here. So I'll point out here, this is my battery box. I have 10 2.2 kilowatt hour modules inside this battery box. The bottom part is where the batteries are. They're attached to some cooling bars, and then coupled together underneath this fairly small area. The battery modules I got were actually from a company in San Diego called Electric GT. What's on top here is essentially a contactor, so it ensures that no power comes out of the battery until there's 12 volt power to it, so it's a safety feature. And then also some remotes for the battery management system. So under here is all the batteries, and here is the contactor and some of the connections for the battery management system. Pretty straightforward there. What we have behind it here, this essentially is a junction box. There's battery management system is in there. There's a couple other contactors, or the connections between the charger, the battery, and then between the battery and the inverter or converter, and then also a bunch of the wires and how they map to the motor controller. What's right here, that's the motor controller. That's essentially the brains of the motor. That takes the feeds from the motor and brings it back to some of the monitoring. It also takes the commands into and delivers how the motor should be, say the throttle control, things of that nature. You can also tell that it's hooked from the battery here through the junction box, and then into the motor controller, and then underneath you can see it's connected to the motor itself. What we have back here is the DC converter. This is really like a step-down converter. It goes from 144 volts to 12 volts. That charges the 12 volt battery. And yes, we still have a 12 volt battery in this conversion. So this piece, when I talk to folks who understand the underneath of an engine or parts of an engine, a combustion engine, this is kind of like the alternator. It takes a feed from the battery here into the converter, and then into the battery. So it keeps the battery charged whenever the ignition is on. So to the battery, 12 battery, yes, is still needed. It charges, or it powers things like the lights, the radio, the blowers and things of that nature. It also serves to power some of the contactors. So the contactors are essentially a switch, and when these contactors receive power from the battery, the 12 volt power, it either turns them off or turns them on. So it either closes them, which lets power flow through, or it opens them, which prevents power from flowing through. Most of these are normally open contactors, so that when they receive power, they close, and the other power source can flow through them. So there are two contactors in the junction box, and then one really massively important one in the battery box, or above the battery box, so that when there's no 12 volt power to the battery box, no juice, no voltage comes out of these, which is the battery cables. And then I think lastly, or no, it's a couple other things, but down in here is the charger. It's actually charging right now. It's a fairly straightforward 3.3 kilowatt per hour charger. It's a very low, slow charger. Maybe I'll upgrade that in the future, but for now it suits its purpose. And then lastly, one thing that people often forget is the combustion engine essentially is a big vacuum pump, along with being a combustion engine itself, which powers a ton of other things in the car. Most importantly, the brakes. So because the electric motor doesn't power the brakes from a vacuum perspective, or doesn't create vacuum itself, you have to create vacuum. And so this vacuum pump is what provides the power to the power brakes. So you have your vacuum pump, you have your brake booster, and then your fluid that carries the pressure down into the brakes. So that is powered by the 12 volt battery. As soon as you turn on the ignition, it creates vacuum unfortunately it's the loudest part of the whole car, and there is some leaking in that battery boost brake booster. That brake booster is probably 40 years old, so it's due for an upgrade or a replacement. So I'll deal with that sometime in the future. Anyway, that's about it under the hood. I will be back to go through other components of the car, including how the motor itself attaches to the transmission. I'll show you some pictures of the motor, some of the mounting brackets, and so forth. So we'll see how the power gets to the wheels. Thank you very much.